This is chapter 4, which is our model of utility. Unlike the general model of supply and demand, this is really specific. And so if you like detail, you're going to love this chapter. So utility is our general word to mean what people get out of consumption. And that's not necessarily pleasure. We use words like satisfaction. So for example, you can get utility out of studying economics, even though most people don't think that that's their definition of fun, although I think it's just lack of appreciation. We're going to build a model of utility, and so our model has very specific preferences. It's a very simple model of utility. It's for sure wrong. In other words, it's an oversimplification. I'm not telling you how to behave when we tell you what the assumptions of a utility model are. Instead, you want to think about how to build a simple model that will still get you to where we want to be, which is to derive a demand curve. Because utility is what underlies how people want their goods. Utility, we're going to model utilities that only depends on your own consumption. So that says you don't depend on your loved one's consumption or your enemy's consumption or anything like that, just your own consumption, so very simple. And we also assume that your tastes stay fixed over time, so it's not one of these cognitive dissonance models where you just, I tell my wife, oh, just buy anything and we'll learn to like it. We're not doing that model in this chapter. So there's some assumptions that underlie utility that you need to be firm about. So one is that it's ordinal, not cardinal. So that means we're not going to measure utility. You're not an 8 and I'm not a 12 by measuring utility. Instead, we're going to define it within each person. So each person is going to say, I like apples better than bananas. Or maybe you're the opposite. You like bananas better than apples. But we're going to talk about A and B as your two choices. And different people like different ones. And we don't know how much more they like one good than another. Or what if they're the same? So that's called indifference. And in fact, what we're using this utility model is to derive an indifference curve. And so you want to know all the assumptions that underlie building an indifference curve so you can use this model to make valid predictions, which is the goal of all models. Another assumption is completeness. That means you can always make a choice. Either bananas are better than apples are better than bananas, or you like them the same, in which case you're indifferent. We assume more is better, or non-satiation. So that means we're talking about goods, not bad. You don't want more garbage. Okay, so garbage isn't a good. But you do want more apples. Okay, we're going for that, and that's the goods. A way to say that is, and what we're going to talk about is decisions on the margin. You've heard economists talk about that before. You've been exposed to it in introductory economics. So we're going to talk about marginal utility. The trouble with marginal utility is that sounds like you can measure it. So we're eventually going to talk about marginal rate of substitution, which is the ratio of marginal utilities. How much do you like one extra apple compared to one extra banana? Okay, so be careful about how you study that. We're going to assume that people are consistent. That doesn't describe anyone I know, but it's a model, it's an assumption in our model, and so we're going to hold on. So if you like apples better than bananas, you like bananas better than carrots, what does that mean? You like apples better than carrots. We're also going to assume that people like variety, and that's going to be called diminishing marginal rate of substitution, or for now we're going to call it diminishing marginal utility, which says as you get one more apple and then another apple and then another apple, you like the last one less than you like the previous ones. And so that's the implication of that is that you're going to want a variety. You aren't going to just want apple. You aren't going to spend all your money on apples. You're going to spend some of your money on bananas or whatever the other goods are. The way we describe taste is called the utility function. That's a mathematical term that means utility depends on your consumption of all the goods you consume. We're going to draw a graph. So if you can't measure utility, how do you draw a graph? The answer is on the axes of your graph, you're going to have apples and bananas. And then you're going to draw a line that shows how your utility is the same along that line. That's going to be called an indifference curve. You're going to have same utility if you have 5 apples and 3 bananas, or maybe 3 apples and 5 bananas, or maybe only 4 and 4. So that's the kind of thing that you're going to want to be very powerful about. It's an interesting trick that economists invented so we can talk about utility without measuring it, which is actually pretty cool. So the graph of utility is going to be downward sloping because since both are goods, both goods are good, that means that if you get more of one good to keep utility the same, you have to give up some of the other good. That's not that what you want to do, but that's going to be a way to describe your indifference, where your utility is constant. We're going to say that the indifference curves never cross. That's because you're consistent, and we'll show that in class. And we're going to say that the curves are curved, not straight lines. So that's sort of interesting. In the supply and demand graph, we were not at all careful about whether it was straight or curved, but in the indifference curves, they're literally curves, not straight lines. And that's a consequence of our assumption that people like variety. So you need to be an expert at marginal rate of substitution, which is the slope of that indifference curve that I just described. Then you also need to know that tastes are going to not be the same by person. So when we draw an indifference curve, that's an individual's indifference curve. Can you draw a market indifference curve? Well, no, because we all have different tastes. So we're going to have to be very careful about how we derive demand from an indifference curve. We're going to do it on an individual basis. And the way we're going to do that is to also model the budget constraint. So just like you can model an indifference curve, you can model a budget constraint. What is your feasible set? In other words, what's possible for you to consume? Are you going to consume all your money, or are you going to throw some of it away because you don't need it? Most of us consume all of our income, and if all goods are goods, and if goods make you better off, a consequence of that is you always spend all your money. And then what's cool about that is that when you model your budget constraint on the same graph as you model your indifference curve. So what does that mean? That means you're looking at the number of apples and the number of bananas. How many apples can you buy if you spend all your money on apples? Well, if you divide your income by the price of apples, that'll tell you the answer. Same with bananas. What's interesting about your budget constraint is it's a straight line. In other words, we're assuming you're a small consumer relative to the market. So even if you spent your entire grocery budget on one good, the price wouldn't change. And so that gives the budget constraint a straight line. In a different environment, that might not be true. So you have to understand the assumptions of this model so you can make good predictions. With a limited income and constant prices, you can then find the exact utility maximizing consumption bundle for the consumer. In other words, the consumer wants to have as much utility as possible, which means you want to get on the highest indifference curve that you can. What determines that? How much money you have. So the indifference curve has to stop when it can just barely touch that budget line, but not go beyond it. If whenever you get a credit card solicitation in the mail, you think your income is going up, you're going to have problems because you're going to be spending money you don't have. And on average, that's inconvenient at the least. Can your budget constraint ever shift? Absolutely. Once you get to be an economics major, you get your high-paying job, your budget constraint will shift out, and your indifference curve will go up. No guarantees on that statement, but it's possible. There's interesting situations when the budget constraint can even be kinked one way or the other, and we'll talk about that. It's sort of interesting way to use our utility model to make predictions. And the other thing that's really important to know is that the ratio that people willing to trade goods and the ratio that that the market is willing to trade goods. Now, what are those two ratios? Well, one is your personal ratio of how much you're willing to trade the two goods for each other. That's called the marginal rate of substitution, as I mentioned earlier. And the market's willingness to trade those goods, that's what the prices tell you, is the price ratio. So we're going to prove by utility maximization that the price ratio equals the marginal rate of substitution for an individual. That has really implications. That has really interesting implications, because what it means is, on the margin, if you buy any apples at all, and if I buy any apples at all, we're each willing to pay the exact same amount, as long as we're in the same market, because we face the same market prices. That doesn't mean that we like the goods the same, but on the margin, we're willing to trade them at the same rate. Become an expert at utility, and you'll be an expert at modeling in economics.